You're listening to Press This, a WordPress community podcast on WMR. Each week, we spotlight members of the WordPress community. I'm your host, Doc Pop, and I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine and my contributions over on torquemag.io. You can subscribe to Press This on Red Circle, iTunes, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting app. You can also download episodes directly from WMR.fm. On this episode of Press This, we'll be talking about headless e-commerce. But first, just a quick side note. On this day in 2011, Rebecca Black released her hit song Friday on YouTube. And within a few months, the song had over 160 million views. 12 years later, the song has reached about 300 million views. Now, if we look back at the web around that time, e-commerce back in 2011 made up a little over 4% of all US retail sales. 12 years later, and e-commerce is up to 16.5% of all retail sales in the US. Now, that's a sharp growth, and unlike Rebecca Black's debut single, that number is still rapidly increasing. We see a steep increase still happening. So on today's show, we're going to talk with Bryan Smith, the Principal Product Manager for Atlas BigCommerce, about current trends in e-commerce and how decoupled WordPress is providing companies with more flexibility. Bryan, welcome to the show. I'm sorry if I accidentally got Friday stuck in your head.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me, Doc. I appreciate it.
How did you get involved with WordPress, and how long have you been in this space?
Oh, wow. That actually, I think it takes me back to 2011, actually. I think it was around the time that I moved to Austin. I was looking for a job, and my brother-in-law was big into WordPress, and he's like, hey, you should set up your own website. So I think that was the first WordPress site that I ever set up. But it wasn't until 2018 that I joined WP Engine, and I worked closely with the Genesis team. It was right after the WP Engine acquisition. I was the product manager for that team for quite a while. And here I am 4.5 years later, now working on headless e-commerce with the Atlas team.
We talk about headless quite often on this show. There's terms like headless, decoupled, and I've heard composable e-commerce. Can you tell us, are those three things the same thing?
Yeah, I would say certainly, headless and decoupled are used interchangeably, quite often. I'd say composable is being used more. Some people use it interchangeably. I think, at least in my experience, I first read about composable from I think it was a Gartner research report, but it's really the idea that, as more companies evolve their approach to, building their digital experiences of the future, they're going to want to use essentially like what they think of as the best of breed tools. You want the best CMS, WordPress, to do the job. You want the best e-commerce platform, whatever that is for you. You want the best checkout solution, and maybe that's not from your e-commerce provider. You want the best product review service. So there's all these different, what they call packaged business capabilities. And of course, microservices and the APIs, these companies make it possible for you to kind of pick and choose the best tools that are going to meet the needs of your site. So that's really what we mean when we say composable. Like, you're going to want to compose the digital experience using the tools that you want. And oftentimes that implies headless, because the presentation layer is just one of those pieces of the puzzle.
Okay. By presentation layer, you're talking about like if it's a website or if it's something else, right? Because it's headless. It could be an iPhone app or something running on a screen on your on your lift or something like that, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
So why is headless architecture playing a larger role in e-commerce these days?
Yeah, I think what a lot of merchants are finding is that, some of the platforms that have, sprung up over the last, 10 or 20 years are kind of all-in-one solutions, but they're all often built kind of on that monolithic architecture. Everything's coupled together. And a lot of the challenges that they run into with that is they're kind of the jack of all trades, the master of none, so to speak. And they're finding that, especially with like the, rise of, these APIs and microservices that are now available, they can get really good services from another provider. A really good example of this is going to be, say you're on, like Shopify or some e-commerce platform like that. Well, they're not really a great CMS. So you would want to use something, if content was important to you, you would want to use something like WordPress. And, a lot of companies do that thing where, they have the commerce site on one domain, and then they have a subdomain for the blog site or something that oftentimes that's WordPress. But those really aren't coupled together at all. I mean, don't want to overload that term coupled, but there's no knowledge between the product data from your e-commerce backend and the content that you have in WordPress. And really what you want for, to provide the most optimized experience for your customers is, this dynamic knowledge where the content and the data are tightly associated with each other. So you can create these really rich, immersive experiences.
You talked about optimize just then. Like why is this more optimized than traditional e-commerce market or sales?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, start to look at, the decoupled headless approach really for the performance benefit, because I think they find kind of like the monolithic architecture can slow them down, but it also makes it challenging, at times for them to make changes. So, why is it important? I think they're looking for the benefits of, they want to be able to quickly adapt. I mean, if anything, like change is the constant here, especially in this space. Like there's new services, new providers, and the really good ones, specialize. Some of the, if you want the latest technology in terms of search, you might want, a third party's API for that. You're not necessarily going to get the latest and greatest from, the existing platform that you're on. So that's just one example, but I mean, that could apply to payments or checkout or product reviews or recommendations, all the things that are, increasingly important to drive those conversions on your store. So I think that's what they're looking for is, again, said it before, the best of breed tools, at the same time, guaranteeing that the performance is the best available, as competitive as possible, because that really starts to matter for things like SEO rankings and just the time, your site visitors are willing to spend on the page. If the mobile experience is too slow, they're going to bounce off to, somebody else that, can deliver it on, for a connection.
It just occurred to me, I feel like I've been talking about this as if it's either or. Is it either or? Are you headless or doing like a traditional, Shopify or WooCommerce, or are these two things, can they go together?
Oh, I think they definitely can go together. I think, like what we're seeing, especially with a lot of the agencies that we talk to, is their clients are already on these e-commerce platforms. It's not that they're looking to re-platform. Like they think those platforms are still really good for order management, for product catalog, a number of these services they provide around the product itself, like the SKU, if you will. They're quite good at those things, but it's the stuff outside of that, search or reviews or checkout, the data analytics, the recommendations, the things to really take your site to the next level. It's those things and the orchestration of those things that those platforms are finding at least increased competition as, more and more, competitors come out every day that really specialize in these areas.
I think that's a good spot for us to take a quick break. We will come back with Bryan Smith to talk about headless e-commerce as well as Atlas BigCommerce Blueprint. So stay tuned after this short message.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Welcome back to Press This, your weekly WordPress show. My name is Doc Pop. I am talking with Bryan Smith, a principal product manager for Atlas eCommerce. So far, we talked about the rise of e-commerce with decoupled websites, and also mentioned Rebecca Black's Friday, which is on my mind today. And I guess kind of bringing it back to that intro, there was another anniversary that just happened about a year ago. Atlas launched Atlas Blueprints at a Decode event. And Bryan, I think you were there or part of that. Can you tell us what is an Atlas Blueprint?
Yeah, absolutely. So Atlas Blueprints are complete starter projects. So it includes the front-end Atlas app. when you deploy one of these blueprints on the Atlas platform, it includes the WordPress site, which is your CMS on the back end. So it provisions that as well. And then it installs all the Atlas plugins that we support, Atlas Content Modeler, the Faust framework, as well as the WP GraphQL plugin so that you can get the data out of WordPress to the Atlas front end. But essentially, you have a complete store with demo content in less than 5-10 minutes. So it's really intended to be something that you can learn the tools of the Atlas platform from. So it can serve kind of as an example in that way. But the ultimate goal of them is really, for you, the user, to be able to take these and essentially extend them for your own use cases, your own projects, so that you have the pre-configured tools and the template that you can use for your next project and the project after that.
So we've talked about Atlas blueprints and a blueprint. You were saying before the show, it's sort of like a starter theme, and this particular blueprint is one that gets you set up to have a shop right away. And then Atlas is WP Engine's headless program to make it easier for WordPress sites to be able to use WP GraphQL and all the hooks that they need. Is that what Atlas is, or is there a better description there?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. So, I mean, the goal of Atlas is to make WordPress a great headless CMS, and they provide a suite of tools that are plugins that make it, like WP GraphQL is a perfect example of that for getting that data out of WordPress. But then Atlas also provides the Node.js hosting for your headless front end as well.
Okay, of course, like that, that would be necessary. So since we're talking about headless e-commerce, I'm curious, do you happen to have any examples of like decoupled e-commerce that a lot of listeners might already be familiar with without even really thinking about, headless?
Yeah. I mean, one that I use a lot is a really good example, and they're always changing, but Nike.com does a great job of, pulling in, rich content with the products that they're featuring, oftentimes all on the same page.
Mm-hmm. And then also Nike would have their web app. I know Adidas has their own web app. Yeezy has its own web app. So like these would be also examples of like not web app, smartphone apps, where a lot of people I know who are big sneakerheads would have the mobile app as well as the website open, and trying to get that drop the minute it comes out. And both of those are pretty much going to the same thing, right? This is an example of like a headless website where they can view it online, or they can also view it through other apps.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. And I mean, those types of sites, I mean, especially like in the sneaker world, are really embracing the way that people want to shop these days, which is, you start on one device and maybe you finish the purchase on another, and you need a similar and consistent experience, personalized experience as well, to, pick the sneakers that you want. So that's a really good example of not only just bringing together like good, rich content with the, products that they're selling, but it's a consistent experience across all the devices that you're going to use to view that content and the products.
There's a belief in marketing that it takes 3 impressions for someone to click on your product. And I don't know how true that is, but I do have to say what you're saying about transitioning from things. You got my number. I didn't even realize it, but I'm thinking about it now. And yeah, I oftentimes start on the eBay app, but don't actually make the purchase until I'm like on my, laptop or something on the web. It's interesting. I hadn't even thought about just how fluid that is sometimes and how it can be. Are we seeing like a massive rise in these sorts of decoupled e-commerce, or is this just sort of the beginning and people are still figuring it out?
Yeah, I think it all depends on like the vantage point I think you're looking at it from. Of course, the decoupled architecture has been around for a really long time, and you've seen like the biggest technology companies embracing it for a really long time. And then these, companies like Nike that aren't necessarily technology companies, although maybe you could argue that they're kind of evolving in that direction out of necessity, are really embracing it. But I think, the context in which we're talking about it with, making WordPress a great headless CMS, bringing it together with these best of breed tools so that you can compose the front end that you want. I think those technologies that have been too complex or too expensive have been a bit out of reach, for the mid-market and, those of us in the WordPress community. I think what you're now seeing is it becoming more accessible. There's more players in the space like WP Engine that are making investments to kind of bring this to the agencies and the users that make up the WordPress community.
Now, by operating a headless e-commerce site, is it doubling your costs because you have to have developers of the app as well as the WordPress side? Or, can you just talk about just the costs associated, not just with hiring developers, but are there extra costs or even savings in hosting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends, right? I would say to go headless with WordPress, you still need to be a developer or have a development team or work with an agency that is experienced in doing it. I think it certainly, varies on, a couple of different factors. Like if you are a developer and you just have an interest in this, there's a lot of ways to get set up cheaply. And, in fact, like Atlas has some low cost plans to get you started. But I think the target audience that we're working most closely with right now are agencies that serve, SMB and mid-sized businesses that are really looking just to embrace the latest available technologies. And, we're finding that so maybe a good example would be a WooCommerce, like a WooCommerce store. A lot of people, mom and pop type shop, embraces WooCommerce as opposed to going with Shopify or somebody else, just because there's not really any cost to get started. If you want to start a business online, and that's great. And, we have tons of customers on WP Engine platform that, fall right into that category. The business does well, they start to scale. And maybe at a certain point, they at least an idea enters their head that, am I outgrowing this platform, or are there new costs that I have to have because I have to get, several more extensions to, facilitate this online business? Would it be cheaper if I went somewhere else? And, should I go headless? And I think, a lot of it will come down to like the volume of transactions, or even just the need for performance that headless gives you. Also the need for composability. Do you really need a whole bunch of different third-party APIs to deliver the front-end experience that your customers want? So I think if it's yes to all of those things, that yes, I need to go headless, I need the performance benefits of it. Yes, I'm willing to hire an agency development team and maybe even some developers on my own staff to maintain the site after it gets built. And yes, I need to bring together, multiple vendors to compose that customized, performant, immersive experience that I have in mind for my headless store. Then I think a lot of folks are finding that it is more cost effective for them because they're optimizing their funnel. They know what their customers want. They know their customers need the best search, recommendation, checkout experience. They're seeing the results of that. And they also need to be at the top of the search results. So they need a performant, SEO optimized website. Now, it's not that you can't get those things with traditional WordPress. It's just the more you scale, the more fierce the competition oftentimes is. And the need not only for speed, but just using the best tools out there to create the, experience that you have in your head, on the site or in the mobile app. There is a good return on investment, but I would say like it can be challenging to, especially, if you're just starting out, it can be challenging to kind of do a good like return on investment. So oftentimes I would recommend going with an agency who's experienced in building these, and they'll be perfect to ask you like the right set of questions on like, what do you need for your site? And they'll help you come up with the right solution. But the right solution might be headless for you.
I think that's a good spot for us to take our final break. When we come back, we'll be talking with Bryan about Atlas BigCommerce Blueprint. And I think we'll talk a little bit about how agencies can better use these sort of tools. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Welcome back to Press This, a WordPress community podcast. I'm your host, Doc Pop. We are talking about decoupled e-commerce, composable websites and shops. We are talking with Bryan Smith from Atlas BigCommerce Blueprint. In the last segment we did, Bryan, you were talking about how some sites might outgrow their website. So these are like WordPress sites that are doing really successful and see that they now need to continue growing. And part of that might be going composable with decoupled e-commerce. And you mentioned something that was interesting to me. You mentioned that a lot of times they'll go to agencies to try to get that help, to try to help build out their sites. I'm just kind of curious, first off, like, is that mostly what, at least what y'all are encountering, is that it's agencies that are building these headless sites, or are a lot of these websites trying to do it themselves?
Yeah, certainly what we're encountering with, Atlas customers is they're oftentimes going through an agency, or an agency is at least involved. Sometimes they'll have development teams on staff, sometimes they don't, but typically with what we're seeing, at least, an agency is involved in, if not the site build, just in kind of the whole process for, helping them realize their vision for their headless site.
And how is Atlas BigCommerce helping those agencies?
Yeah, that's a great one, because this blueprint actually is geared towards agency developers who are working with clients that are on BigCommerce. So with this tool, an agency can spin up this blueprint site in under 10 minutes. Like, that includes the provisioning of the WordPress instance, the WP Engine hosts, the Atlas front-end app. It integrates with their GitHub repo. It installs all the plugins, activates them, and it builds that storefront using all those tools that I mentioned, Atlas Content Modeler, WP GraphQL, Faust, and the BigCommerce connector plugin that we introduced with this blueprint to build a headless storefront in under 10 minutes. So that really helps them get to production faster. It kind of outsources some of that boilerplate that they would have to otherwise spend a lot of time setting up. And the intent is, for us to take on that kind of stuff so that the agency developers can spend more time working on the really interesting components of the site that are a part of their client's vision.
I'm just curious here, thinking about this from the agency perspective. If they're talking to a client who's just wants just an e-commerce site, they don't ever mention anything about decoupled architecture, is there ever a reason that an agency might still try to pitch them something like this? Like, is it maybe like further down the road you might need this, or this will save you some money in the long run? Is there any reason that they might do something like that?
Absolutely. I think that the things that, especially the agencies that, are close partners of ours, the things that they're looking for when they're having these conversations with their clients is, tell us about the solution that you're on, tell us about the changes that you have with it, and, tell us about your vision. As we've already covered, like, the e-commerce environment is ever changing. It's changing faster than ever. If there is a desire on the client's part to move very fast, embrace the latest technologies, they want to make changes to the site without heavy customization. They want to move quickly in response to a customer demand. A perfect example is what we've seen with COVID over the last few years, with more people buying more things online. The need to quickly respond to customer demand is more important than ever. And if they also want to be less reliant on the commerce platform that they're on, because, as we mentioned earlier, those are really optimized for managing their product catalog, but not necessarily for managing their content or their customer relationships, or even things like search and recommendations. So I think those are the things that the agencies are looking for, when they're asking the clients, what's important to you? What's your vision for, this online store? And if they're looking for best of breed tools, the fastest performance out there, and less reliance on that commerce platform, oftentimes they're going to suggest the headless composable solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bryan, I think that's all we have time for today. I really enjoyed talking with you. If you're just tuning in, we talked with Bryan Smith, Principal Product Manager for Atlas eCommerce, about the new Atlas BigCommerce Blueprint, and just kind of a recap of Blueprint is sort of like a quick theme that you can install to get started really quickly setting up a headless e-commerce site using WordPress. Bryan, if people want to learn more about you, what's a good way for people to follow, maybe ask any questions after the show or find out more about Atlas?
Sure. Yeah. There's a few ways. You can find me on Twitter. It's Smith K. Bryan, at Smith K. Bryan. You can email me directly, brian.smith@wpengine.com. I'm also in the WP Engine agency partner channel, just under Bryan Smith, Bryan Smith. So find me there, ask me questions. Love to always engage with folks that are interested in headless and composable commerce.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Bryan. And thanks to all the folks for listening today. Press This is a WordPress community podcast from WMR. You can follow our adventures at Torque Magazine on Twitter. You can go to @thetorquemag, or you can go to torquemag.io, where you can find older episodes of this podcast as well as our weekly live streams. You can subscribe to Press This on Red Circle, iTunes, Spotify, or download directly from WMR.fm. I'm your host, Doc Pop. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love spotlighting members of the community each week on Press This.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of WebmasterRadio.fm's management or sponsors. Any rebroadcast or redistribution without authorized consent of WebmasterRadio.fm is prohibited.